Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in the Olds Home Center on that crisp October afternoon in 1984 smells of sawdust, paint thinner, and possibility. It's a cathedral of suburban aspiration. Aisles stacked high with the raw materials of the American dream. A new deck, a freshly painted nursery, a repaired leaky faucet. On this Saturday, the aisles hum with the quiet energy of weekend projects. A father debates the merits of different drill bits with his son. A young couple, hands clasped, measure a roll of carpet, imagining it in their first home. It is a place of construction, of creation, a tangible manifestation of domestic hope. But deep within its labyrinth of shelves, in the quiet corner of the home goods section, another kind of creation is underway. It's a simple, almost elegant device, assembled with a practiced hand. 3 wooden matches, heads facing inward, are wrapped around a filtered cigarette with a common brown rubber band. The entire bundle rests on a small folded piece of ruled yellow paper, torn from a legal pad. It is a timer, built from the most mundane of objects, things you could find in any desk drawer or gas station. It has no malice of its own. It is just an instrument, a patient, silent mechanism of chemical potential, waiting for the slow, steady burn of tobacco to reach its inevitable conclusion. For a few minutes it sits dormant, hidden behind a stack of fluffy polyester pillows. The cigarette smolders, a tiny orange ember shrinking incrementally, a miniature fuse burning through time. Then the first flicker. The intense heat of the cherry reaches the sensitive, sulfurous heads of the matches. They don't just light, they erupt in a small, sharp burst of chemical fury, a miniature explosion of light and heat. The yellow paper, acting as kindling, instantly curls, blackens, and catches flame. The flame, small and innocent at first, touches the clear plastic packaging of the pillows. The plastic melts away, and the fire finds what it was designed to find: polyurethane foam. Polyurethane, a miracle of modern chemistry, is designed for comfort, for insulation, for softness. But when introduced to a flame, it becomes a solid form of gasoline. It burns with a speed and ferocity that borders on the demonic. The small flame doesn't just grow, it detonates. It undergoes a terrifying metamorphosis, transforming from a spark into a ravenous, roaring beast in mere seconds. The fire races up the shelving unit, a vertical geyser of orange and black, devouring the pillows, the blankets, the upholstery. It vomits a churning cloud of superheated toxic smoke that boils toward the high warehouse ceiling. The smoke is a killer in its own right. A thick, greasy soup saturated with hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide. The mundane sounds of a normal Saturday, the squeak of cartwheels, the beep of a register, a child's laugh, are swallowed by a sudden deafening roar, a sound like a freight train derailing inside the building. The smell of sawdust is replaced by the acrid, chemical stench of melting plastic and something far more primal, the smell of fear. The dream of creation becomes a nightmare of absolute destruction, and amidst the chaos that will soon follow, the screaming sirens, the desperate stampede for exits, the arrival of heroes running toward the inferno, one man will stand apart, watching, studying, and understanding the fire with an intimacy that no one else can possibly possess. He understands its every breath, its every move, its every nuance, because he is its father. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a creator-hero complex. We examine the case of John Orr, one of the most respected and knowledgeable arson investigators in Southern California, who was simultaneously one of the most prolific and destructive serial arsonists in American history. This is not just a story of who lit the fires, but of the deeply fractured psyche that compelled a man to create the very chaos he was celebrated for controlling. We will explore the chilling psychology of a public servant who built his reputation on the ashes of his own secret work, a man who didn't just solve the puzzle, but designed it from the very first piece, laid it out with meticulous care, and then pretended to be surprised at the picture it made. It's a story about the terrifying realization that sometimes the guardian is the wolf, and the fireman is the one holding the match. To understand the monster, you must first understand the man, and the mask he wore. To his colleagues in the Glendale Fire Department, John Leonard Orr was no monster. He was, by all outward appearances, a model fire captain and an uncommonly gifted arson investigator. Born in Los Angeles in 1949, Orr had a complex path to the fire service. His first ambition was to wear the blue of the Los Angeles Police Department. He was drawn to the authority, the action, the clear demarcation between good and evil. But he was rejected. He also tried to become a sheriff's deputy and was again turned away. So he settled. He joined the Glendale Fire Department, a career that offered uniforms and emergencies. But in his mind, it was a consolation prize. This early rejection planted a seed of resentment, a feeling that his true talents were being overlooked. He was determined to prove that he was smarter, better, and more capable than those who had dismissed him. He channeled this ambition into his work as an arson investigator. He devoured textbooks on fire science, studied burn patterns with an almost religious fervor, and quickly developed a reputation for being a walking encyclopedia of arson. When he walked a fire scene, his peers saw a master at work. He had an uncanny knack for finding the point of origin, the epicenter of the blaze from which all other clues radiated. He could read the subtle language of V-shaped smoke patterns on a wall, interpret the depth of char on a wooden beam, and reconstruct the life and death of a fire with what seemed like preternatural insight. He was a teacher, a mentor, frequently lecturing at conferences, and sharing his encyclopedic knowledge with other investigators from across the state. He was sharp, he was confident, some would say arrogant, and he was almost always right. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man you'd want sifting through the wreckage of your life, looking for answers. But beneath this veneer of dedication and expertise, another life was being lived, a life fueled by a wholly different set of desires. Orr's public identity was built on order, investigation, and the restoration of control. His private identity, the one he concealed from everyone, was built on chaos, destruction, and the ultimate act of control, creation. He craved recognition, not just for solving the crime, but for committing it. This duality is the very definition of the creator-hero complex, a psychological construct often seen in public safety professions. It describes an individual who creates a crisis specifically so they can resolve it and receive acclaim for their heroism. It's a desperate, pathological feedback loop. The arsonist sets the fire, and the investigator basks in the glow of the subsequent investigation, feeding a narcissistic hunger that can never be truly satisfied. For John Orr, the thrill wasn't just the orange flames, it was the entire performance, from the first spark of ignition to the final authoritative report he would file about his own secret handiwork. It is crucial to distinguish Orr's psychology from that of a classic pyromaniac. Pyromania, as a clinical disorder, is characterized by an impulsive, irresistible urge to set fires to relieve tension or achieve intense gratification. The fire itself is the goal. For Orr, The fire was merely the means to an end. His arsons were not impulsive. They were meticulously planned. He was a pathological arsonist, driven by a need for attention, excitement, and a sense of power and revenge against a world he felt had undervalued him. The fire was the catalyst that allowed him to step onto a stage of his own making, to be the smartest man in the room, the hero who could make sense of the chaos that he and only he truly understood. This pathological need for validation would drive him to escalate his crimes, from small, manageable fires to raging infernos that would ultimately consume lives. His criminal career began subtly, a slow burn that would eventually escalate into a conflagration. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a series of small, perplexing fires began to plague the Glendale area. They were often brush fires in the undeveloped hillsides or nuisance fires in trash cans and alleyways. They were difficult to solve, but they served a critical purpose for Orr. They kept the department busy. They gave investigator Orr problems to solve, opportunities to showcase his skills, to be seen as the indispensable expert. He would frequently discover these fires himself, calling them in and then taking the lead on the investigation. He was honing his craft, not just as an investigator, but as an arsonist. He was learning how to set fires that were challenging but not impossible to analyze, leaving just enough of a trail for a clever man, namely himself, to follow. These early acts were rehearsals, small-scale productions for the grand, terrifying theater he was about to unleash upon the unsuspecting communities of Southern California. The curtain rose on his main performance in 1984. The landscape of Southern California, particularly the sprawling, sun-baked San Joaquin Valley, became his personal canvas. A rash of fires began erupting in communities up and down the Highway 99 corridor, a vital artery of commerce and travel. The targets were disturbingly consistent. Retail stores, specifically fabric shops like Hancock Fabrics and Joann Fabrics, craft stores like Oles, and the drapery and bedding sections of larger department stores. The fires were almost always set during business hours, when the stores were filled with shoppers and employees. The method was simple, yet diabolical, a signature that would eventually tie the dozens of disparate fires together. Orr's incendiary device, the one that would eventually become his calling card, was a marvel of low-tech ingenuity. He would take a few cigarettes, usually 3 or 4, and wrap them in a piece of yellow, ruled paper. He'd bind the bundle to a book of paper matches with a rubber band. When he lit the cigarette, it acted as a slow-burning fuse. Depending on how much of the cigarette was left to burn, he had a 10 to 20-minute delay. This gave him ample time to place the device on a low shelf, hidden among flammable materials, like bolts of fabric or foam pillows, and casually walk out of the store, melting back into the anonymous crowds. The choice of targets was tactical and deeply psychological. Fabric and craft stores are packed from floor to ceiling with highly combustible materials: cotton, polyester, foam, plastics. A small flame can become an uncontrollable blaze in minutes. By setting the fires during the day, he maximized the potential for chaos, public panic, and a large-scale emergency response. He wasn't just burning buildings. He was attacking the soft, domestic underbelly of suburban life. These were places women frequented, places of creativity and homemaking. His attacks were an assault on that sense of safety and order. The fires were a profound puzzle for investigators. They were clearly the work of a single, methodical individual. The geographic pattern was there. A string of arsons tracing a path along a major state artery. The modus operandi was consistent. but the motive was entirely absent. There was no extortion, no attempt to claim credit, no political agenda. There was just the fire. It was arson for the sake of arson, a seemingly random campaign of terror waged against the mundane backdrop of everyday commerce. Local fire departments were overwhelmed. The arsonist, dubbed the pillow pyro by the media for his tendency to start fires in bedding departments, was prolific and elusive. In response, a multi-agency task force was formed, bringing together the best arson investigators in the state to hunt for this phantom fire setter. The task force was called the Pillow Pyro Task Force, and it included representatives from local fire departments, the State Fire Marshal's Office, and the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They met, they strategized, they shared data, and among the experts called upon to lend his considerable knowledge to this very task force, a man who attended the meetings and offered his own theories on the suspect's profile and methods, was the respected and knowledgeable Captain John Orr of the Glendale Fire Department. He was literally inside the tent, helping to direct the hunt for himself. The fire at the Olds Home Center in South Pasadena on October 10, 1984, was different. It represented a horrific and irreversible escalation. While many of Orr's previous fires had caused significant property damage and spread fear, the Olds fire was a killer. The store was a massive 25,000-square-foot warehouse-style building, a tinderbox of flammable merchandise ranging from lumber and paint to carpets and foam padding. When Orr's simple device ignited in a pile of polyurethane foam, it unleashed a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. The fire spread with a speed that defied belief, generating a superheated, toxic cloud of black smoke that quickly filled the cavernous space, dropping from the ceiling like a black curtain. Visibility was reduced to 0 in seconds, and the air became a lethal cocktail of cyanide gas and carbon monoxide, choking the life from anyone who breathed it. Panic erupted. Shoppers and employees scrambled for exits, blinded and disoriented in the suffocating pitch-black darkness. 4 people didn't make it out. 12-year-old Matthew Troidel was in the store with his grandmother, Ada Deal. They were shopping for materials for a home project. In the chaos and darkness, the small boy was separated from his grandmother. Firefighters later found his body near the paint aisle. His grandmother, 50-year-old Ada Deal, was also found, having been overcome by the smoke while desperately searching for him. A 26-year-old employee, Carolyn Krause, a recent college graduate who had just started working at the store, was trapped and perished in the inferno, and 17-year-old Jimmy Satina, a high school student who worked at the store part-time as a stockboy, was also overcome by the smoke and flames. 4 lives extinguished in a matter of minutes, all because of one man's pathological need for attention. Their deaths transformed the case. The Pillow Pyro was no longer just a serial arsonist. He was a quadruple murderer. The investigation, which had been serious, now became one of the highest priorities for law enforcement in California. The pressure to find the person responsible was immense, and through it all, John Orr was there. He walked the blackened, tragic, and still smoldering scene at Olds, offering his expert analysis on the fire's origin and behavior to his fellow investigators. He noted the extreme speed of the blaze, the telltale signs of a rapid hot burn, and the specific patterns of destruction, all characteristics he himself had engineered. He was, quite literally, investigating his own murders, using the deaths of a toddler, a grandmother, and 2 young workers as a new, more dramatic stage for his performance. This breathtaking hypocrisy defined his existence for the next several years. He lived a life of staggering cognitive dissonance. By day, he was Captain Orr, the respected public servant, the man who hunted the arsonists that plagued his community. By night, and often during his lunch breaks, he was the very monster he pretended to hunt. He set fires throughout the 1980s, a relentless campaign of terror that seemed to have no end. He set fires in Bakersfield, in Tulare, in Fresno. He burned down a massive hardware store in North Hollywood in a blaze eerily similar to Ol's, though thankfully with no fatalities. He even set a series of devastating brush fires in the hills surrounding his own city of Glendale. Fires that threatened homes and required a massive response from multiple fire departments, including his own. He would often be among the first investigators on the scene of these fires, directing operations, comforting victims, and collecting evidence against himself. The psychological audacity required to maintain such a double life is difficult to comprehend. Orr compartmentalized his existence. The two halves of his life, the creator and the hero, were kept meticulously separate in his mind, yet they were symbiotically linked. One could not exist without the other. The fires gave him a sense of power and control that his legitimate life lacked. They were his secret masterpieces. But the real payoff came afterward. It was the thrill of the investigation, the intellectual challenge of the puzzle, the admiration of his peers, the feeling of being at the center of the storm. He wasn't just an arsonist. He was an artist who desperately needed to attend his own gallery openings and listen to the critics rave about the brilliance of the work, all while remaining anonymous. This period of his activity also revealed a crucial element of his pathology. He was a meticulous record keeper. He documented his fires, not in a diary, but in a far more audacious format. John Orr, the fire captain, was an aspiring writer. He began working on a novel, a manuscript he titled Points of Origin. The book was a work of fiction, but it was a chillingly thin disguise for reality. The protagonist, a firefighter named Aaron Stiles, was a serial arsonist. Stiles used a delayed incendiary device identical to Orr's. The targets in the novel, fabric stores, hardware stores, retail outlets, were the same as Orr's real-life targets. The novel even included a detailed account of a massive, fatal fire at a hardware store called Cal's that was a near-perfect mirror of the tragic Ol's fire. In his manuscript, Orr wasn't just confessing, he was bragging. He was crafting a legacy, documenting his genius for a world he believed was too foolish to ever catch him. The manuscript was the ultimate expression of his narcissism, a literary monument to his own dark cleverness. It would also become one of the most powerful weapons used against him. For years, the multi-agency task force chased a ghost. They had a pattern, a signature, and a growing list of crime scenes that stretched across hundreds of miles and nearly a decade, but they had no viable suspect. The pillow pyro was prolific, methodical, and seemingly invisible. The break in the case didn't come from a flash of forensic brilliance at a single crime scene, but from a moment of insight born of pure frustration and a stunning coincidence. In January of 1987, a conference for arson investigators from all over California was held in the city of Fresno. It was a gathering of the state's top experts, a place to share knowledge, discuss new techniques, and network over coffee and war stories. John Orr was, of course, in attendance, a respected figure leading seminars and holding court. During the few days the conference was in session, a series of suspicious fires broke out in and around Fresno. A craft store went up in flames. So did a fabric store. The fires bore the unmistakable signature of the pillow pyro. The timing was too perfect, too brazen to be a coincidence. This was the moment the paradigm shifted. Marvin G. Casey, a captain with the Bakersfield Fire Department and a key member of the task force, was at the conference. The absurdity of the situation struck him with the force of a physical blow. Here they were, all the best minds in arson investigation gathered in one place to figure out how to catch this guy, and he was out there, setting fires right under their noses, almost mocking them. Casey was struck by a terrifying but perfectly logical idea. The arsonist wasn't some random outsider. The fires in Fresno, timed perfectly with the conference, strongly suggested the arsonist was an attendee. He had to be one of them. The wolf was in the sheep pen, disguised as a shepherd. This revelation was both a breakthrough and a gut punch to the tight-knit fraternal community of fire investigators. It meant that one of their own, a person they had likely shared a meal with, someone who had access to their methods and their thinking, was the very person responsible for this reign of terror. The task force, now operating with this new, chilling hypothesis, began a methodical and painstaking process of elimination. They obtained the sign-in rosters from the Fresno conference and from a similar conference held previously in Pacific Grove, which, they now realized, had also been plagued by a rash of signature fires during the event. They finally had a list of names. The next step was to create a massive matrix of data. They mapped out every known pillow pyro fire by date, time, and location on a huge map of California. Then they began the arduous pre-computerized process of cross-referencing this map with the list of investigators. They had to determine which individuals had the means, motive, and most importantly, the opportunity to be at or near all these disparate locations when the fires were set. It was a monumental data-sifting task involving personnel files, travel vouchers, and expense reports, all scrutinized for clues. Slowly, painstakingly, the list of potential suspects began to shrink. Most of the investigators on the list could be eliminated. They had rock-solid alibis, or their work locations in Northern California or San Diego made it geographically impossible for them to have set the cluster of fires in the San Joaquin Valley. But one name kept appearing. One man seemed to have an uncanny, almost magnetic connection to the geographic footprint of the pillow pyro, Captain John Orr of the Glendale Fire Department. His travel records, his conference attendance, his proximity to so many of the fires, it all started to paint a deeply disturbing picture. He was not just a possible suspect. He was becoming the only logical suspect. The task force, now under the guidance of the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, focused its full attention on Orr. They began to build a formal profile of their unsub with the help of federal profilers, and the man they were profiling looked more and more like the Glendale fire captain. The profile suggested a creator-hero type, a firefighter or police officer, likely feeling overlooked or undervalued in his career, who created emergencies to place himself in a position of importance. The profile suggested someone intelligent, knowledgeable about fire behavior, and meticulous, someone who would likely insert himself into the investigation and keep souvenirs or records of his accomplishments. It described John Orr perfectly. Investigators began a covert surveillance operation. They placed a tracking device on his car. They watched him, tracked his movements, and built a timeline of his life that they could lay over the timeline of the fires. The overlaps were too numerous and too precise to be coincidental. The net was closing. The final, irrefutable piece of evidence came not from a new fire, but from an old one. investigators re-examined the evidence from a fire scene at a fabric store in Tulare. They meticulously sifted through the cold, cataloged debris, looking for any trace of the incendiary device. They found what they were looking for: a small, partially burned piece of the ruled yellow paper the arsonist used. Stored as evidence for years, it was now subjected to a more advanced forensic analysis. Using a specialized chemical process, the crime lab was able to lift a single, partial latent fingerprint from the delicate, charred paper. It was a long shot, but they ran it through the databases. It didn't match any known criminals. Then, they took the next logical step. They began comparing it to the fingerprints of the suspects on their shortlist. When they compared it to the fingerprints of Captain John Orr, taken from his personnel file, they found a match. They had him. The ghost who had haunted California for nearly a decade finally had a face, a name, and a fingerprint. The arrest of John Orr on December 4, 1991, sent shockwaves through the law enforcement and firefighting communities of California. The idea that one of the state's most esteemed arson investigators was, in fact, its most prolific arsonist was almost unbelievable. It was a betrayal of the highest order, a violation of a sacred trust. Orr, true to his narcissistic character, was reportedly arrogant and dismissive upon his arrest, confident that the authorities had made a colossal mistake, and that he, with his superior intellect, would easily clear his name. He had spent years living a lie, and he was convinced he could talk his way out of this final performance. He seemed to view the entire situation as a professional disagreement between intellectual inferiors and himself. The search of his home, however, told a very different story. Investigators uncovered a treasure trove of incriminating evidence that solidified their case and painted a vivid portrait of his obsession. They found videotapes of news reports about the fires he had set. They found newspaper clippings meticulously detailing the arsons. They found maps with pins and circles pinpointing the locations of his fires. They even found materials in his garage: rubber bands, paper matches, yellow legal pads, consistent with those used to build his signature devices. But the most damning discovery, the piece of evidence that would lay his psyche bare, was the completed manuscript for his novel, Points of Origin. When investigators read it, they were stunned. It was a de facto confession, a detailed blueprint of his crimes written by his own hand. The fictional account of the hardware store fire, which his protagonist Aaron Stiles sets, was so chillingly similar to the real-life Olds fire that it read like a factual report. He described the specific type of foam that burns rapidly, the way the smoke would fill the store, the panic of the shoppers. He wrote about the investigation from the arsonist's point of view, detailing how his character evaded detection and even participated in the subsequent investigation. The novel provided the prosecution with an unprecedented window into the mind of the arsonist, revealing not just his methods, but his motives, his fantasies, and his contempt for his colleagues. It was the ultimate act of hubris, a need to document his genius, and it would be his undoing. The legal battle that followed was complex. Orr was first tried in federal court in 1992 on charges related to a series of fires set between 1984 and 1990. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorneys Stephen D. Stein and Michael J. Jenico, built their case like a brick wall. Layer by meticulous layer, they knew they didn't have an eyewitness who saw or light any of the fires. Their case was entirely circumstantial, but it was overwhelming. They presented the geographic and temporal patterns of the fires, showing the jury on a massive map how the blazes perfectly coincided with Orr's presence in those areas for conferences, investigations, or personal travel. They introduced the latent fingerprint, the single piece of direct physical evidence linking him to one of the incendiary devices, a silent witness from the past. They presented the evidence found in his home, the library of his own crimes. And, most powerfully, they used his own words against him, reading key excerpts from Points of Origin to the jury, demonstrating the eerie, undeniable parallels between his fiction and the fiery reality he had created. Orr's defense team tried to portray him as a dedicated, perhaps overly obsessive investigator who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, over and over again. They argued that the fingerprint could have been transferred innocently at some point. They tried to dismiss the novel as nothing more than the product of a creative mind, a work of fiction inspired by, but not based on, real events. But the sheer weight of the evidence was too much to overcome. The pattern was too perfect, the coincidences too numerous, and the manuscript too specific. The jury saw through the facade. In July of 1992, John Orr was found guilty of 3 counts of arson and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. But the legal proceedings were not over. While the federal conviction put him behind bars for the property crimes, he had not yet been held accountable for the 4 lives lost in the Olds Home Center fire. In 1998, Orr faced a state trial in California, this time for murder. The stakes were even higher. The prosecution team, armed with the evidence from the federal trial and additional forensic analysis of the Olds fire, laid out the case that Orr was directly responsible for the deaths of Matthew Troidel, Ada Deal, Carolyn Krause, and Jimmy Satina. They presented expert testimony on the fire's behavior, arguing that it was intentionally set, and that the arsonist, a trained fire expert, would have known that setting such a fire in a crowded store was highly likely to result in death or great bodily injury. This established the legal standard for first-degree murder under the felony murder rule. Once again, his own manuscript was a star witness against him. The jury found John Leonard Orr guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence to be served after his federal time was completed. The hero of the fire service was now officially a convicted serial arsonist and a mass murderer. John Orr's case is a masterclass in the anatomy of the creator-hero complex. He was not a typical pyromaniac, driven by an irresistible, almost sexual urge to watch things burn. His actions were not impulsive. They were calculated, planned, and executed with a specific psychological goal in mind: the acquisition of narcissistic supply. The fires themselves were merely the first act of a much larger play. Orr's true gratification came from the aftermath. It came from the screaming sirens, the pulsing lights, the chaos, the television cameras, the hushed and respectful tones of his colleagues as he walked a scene, and the intellectual challenge of solving the crime he had so perfectly committed. He was the author of a grand, destructive narrative, and the lead character was always and only himself. This psychological need to be the hero of a story of his own making is what makes his case so chilling and so instructive. He didn't just want to be a firefighter. He wanted to be the most important, most knowledgeable, and most indispensable person in the room. When his regular career failed to provide this constant level of adulation, he began to manufacture the emergencies that would thrust him into the spotlight. He controlled the problem, and he controlled the solution. This gave him an ultimate sense of power, a godlike ability to manipulate the world around him, turning ordinary suburban landscapes into stages for his personal drama. His novel, Points of Origin, was not merely a confession. It was an attempt to write his own legend, to ensure that his genius, as he saw it, would be recognized, even if it was only by himself. The investigation that caught him is a testament to the power of methodical police work and behavioral analysis. The initial breakthrough was not a fingerprint or a piece of DNA. It was a conceptual leap. It was the realization by investigators like Marvin Casey that the profile of their suspect might not fit that of a traditional outsider, but rather an insider, someone hiding in plain sight. This shift in perspective, from looking outside the community to looking within it, was the key that unlocked the entire case. The subsequent data analysis, the painstaking cross-referencing of names and locations, was grueling but essential work that narrowed the field from hundreds of possibilities down to one. The case against John Orr was an intricate mosaic, built from thousands of tiny, disparate pieces of information that, when assembled, revealed a single, horrifying image of betrayal. Ultimately, the story of John Orr serves as a profound and disturbing reminder of the masks people wear and the darkness that can hide behind a veneer of respectability and public service. He exploited the trust placed in him as a firefighter to carry out his crimes, using his insider knowledge of investigative techniques to evade capture for years. He turned the symbols of his profession, knowledge of fire, access to crime scenes, the trust of his peers, into potent weapons. His career was a performance, his life a lie, and the ashes he sifted through with such authority were the remnants of his own secret work. The anatomy of his crimes reveals a psychology built not on a love of fire, but on a desperate, all-consuming love of self, a narcissism so malignant that it valued his own ego above the lives of anyone who stood in his way. John Orr, the firemaker, was undone by the oldest and most human of flaws, a pride so profound that he felt the need to write it all down, never believing that the heroes he pretended to be were smart enough to one day read his story and see it for the confession it truly was. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.